the Oklahoma Newsroom, you're watching the Press Row. I'm Jenny Carlson here with Barry Trammell. Barry, it is college football season at its height, at its best, right here on our own backyard. Oklahoma State and Oklahoma really bringing the epicenter of college football right here to the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma State number 6 in the latest college football playoff rankings. Oklahoma number 7. What do we know about where Oklahoma State and Oklahoma rank, and just in terms of being able to play into one of those Final Four spots? Is that a possibility, or is there reason to really be concerned about this perception that the Big 12 doesn't play any defense? Could that hold them out?
Yeah, I think the perception still lingers some. I don't think it's going to affect Oklahoma much at all. You know, the Sooners have great defensive numbers, even if you use the traditional standards. So if they hold Oklahoma out, it won't be because of the defensive perception. It could hurt Oklahoma State, although I don't think it will, because I think if the Cowboys went out, I think they'll still get in. I think they would jump a Notre Dame. I think they would get that 4th spot if everybody keeps winning. Mm-hmm. Hard to imagine a 12-0 Big 12 team that had finished the year with victories over TCU, Baylor, and Oklahoma not getting in. Oklahoma, it's a little bit different. The loss to Texas looms. So, I mean, I think that's still a shaky question, Oklahoma versus Notre Dame.
Right.
But I don't think it'll be the defensive perception that hangs over Oklahoma. It'll just be that loss to Texas.
Right. No, I agree. I think seeing these teams at 6 and 7, to me, that means they're in position to jump into that top 4 if they win out. If one of the two wins out, I think they've got a great chance to be there. I think it may come down to some different things, some different variables, Barry. I think the Notre Dame question maybe looms larger in Oklahoma's mind because they've got that common opponent. They'd both be one-loss teams. If it came down to who gets in, Notre Dame or Oklahoma, I think that OU fans have to be rooting hard for Stanford here in a couple weeks to maybe upend a Notre Dame. But if you're Oklahoma State, to me, the bigger question, if it comes down to a one-loss Notre Dame or Oklahoma State, to me, it breaks down to, Oklahoma State didn't play anybody in the non-conference. Does that come back to bite them? Could that be the issue for Oklahoma State, or does the end run just outweigh that? We don't know the answer. I think the end run outweighs, but I don't know. Are you reading the tea leaves at all?
I think they'll take into consideration OSU's non-conference schedule, but when you're compared to Notre Dame, it's hard to compare because Notre Dame doesn't have a conference or non-conference schedule. They just have a schedule.
Right.
And Notre Dame ended up with a couple of bad games. They got UMass on the schedule, which frankly is a lot worse than the typical worst Notre Dame schedule.
Yeah.
In that regard, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State are actually a little bit lucky. Notre Dame typically has a tougher, broad-based 12-game schedule than what they've got this year.
Yeah.
The
ACC games that ended up on their schedule this year, not great, really.
Georgia Tech ended up not very good. Boston College, Wake Forest. You're talking about teams that are not good at all and really are like playing Iowa State or Kansas. So I think at the end of the day, I think Oklahoma State's schedule and Oklahoma's schedule are going to match up okay with Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. I think OSU, by going 12-0, gets the jump on Notre Dame. I don't know about the Oklahoma, as you mentioned. The Texas thing is problematic because that's in the committee bylaws. If you're comparing two teams, common opponents is one of the factors you look at.
Yeah, and you can't ignore what happened there. I think another question that we may never know the answer to, if it comes down to Notre Dame and Oklahoma State on that final selection, I wonder if there's any name recognition. I can't think of a better way to put it, Barry. Notre Dame's such a brand, such a draw to, football fans really across the country when you've got that Notre Dame aura and the fan base that's spread far and wide. Oklahoma State obviously has a great following around here but doesn't sort of have that national recognition. Does that hurt? I mean, I don't think that's a spoken thing, but I wonder if that becomes an issue for the committee. Are they going to weigh that out at all, even in unthought of sort of subconscious ways?
Subliminal is exactly what the problem is, and the truth is, sure, it'll come into play. The idea, we see it with Ohio State right now. Ohio State's resume doesn't mean it is. Their resume is not as good as all kinds of teams below them, but they got the Buckeyes on the helmet. They got the national title from last year in their holster. They've got a lot of tradition and name recognition. So clearly Ohio State's getting some benefit of the doubt. And, the truth of the matter is, we saw this throughout the BCS era. Oklahoma got the benefit of the doubt because they're one of the blue bloods of college football. Oklahoma State has got to be hopeful that it doesn't come to that. And I don't think it will. I mean, if the Cowboys go 12-0 and finish off,
this gauntlet, yeah.
If they especially if they beat an Oklahoma that is just soaring, and people worry about OU's ranking. OU's been, they've been taking, they went from 16 to 12 to 7, and if they beat TCU, could be even higher. So if Oklahoma State's able to withstand that and add that to its resume, I think the Cowboys are going to be okay.
Yeah, and I agree. I think if a lot of people, what they're saying is true, that if Oklahoma wins out, they're deserving of a spot. If Oklahoma State beats out that team, why would they not be deserving of a spot? That has to be in the consideration.
And here's well, we can talk about this later, but I think Oklahoma's going to club TCU, which is just going to increase the talk about, look how the Sooners are playing, they're dominant, blah, blah, blah. And that's only good for Oklahoma State, because that means if the Cowboys can knock them off, it's even better.
Well, that brings us to our next question. You're watching The Press Row. I'm Jenny here with Barry. Let's talk about best case scenarios. Let's talk about what Oklahoma State and Oklahoma would have to hope in the best case scenario happens in these next 2 weeks. I mean, obviously, if teams ahead of them lose, I mean, that's clearly. But if teams continue to win that are ahead of them, you mentioned if OU beats TCU by a wide margin, does that help OSU? Are there some other things that could help OSU in your mind that aren't related to what OSU does on the field?
Well, this is sort of counterintuitive, but it actually helps everybody if Oklahoma State doesn't kill Baylor. If OSU goes out and beats Baylor 49-10, that's going to plant seeds in a lot of people's mind that Baylor's just not very good.
Yeah.
Go back to 2008 when OU routed Tech in that showdown, 65-21, and a lot of people said, well, you just throw out Tech, even though it was a three-way tie with OU, Texas, and Tech.
They just got the boot,
Well, you throw them out because OU beat them so bad. If OU had won that game 38-28, people say, ooh, good win. So that's what, in some ways, when you play Baylor, you need to score as many and as often as possible, and if you beat them 49-10, that's what you beat them. But a good solid win in some ways might even help Oklahoma State more than a rout, because it would keep Baylor's status. And then for the Thanksgiving Friday when the Bedlams play, if they're fortunate to both win this Saturday, when they play on that Saturday, it'd be nice if the day before, if Baylor would go ahead and beat TCU, because then I think Baylor probably finishes in the top 10. People talk about the conspiracy with against the Big 12. The committee actually is treating Baylor really well. I mean, they had them ranked 6th when they had nothing on their resume.
Yeah,
they're still 10th. They've dropped TCU like a rock, but Baylor's still 10th.
Yeah.
So the committee sort of likes Baylor. So if Baylor can finish 10-2, that would enhance the resumes of the Bedlam winner.
Yeah, and obviously, if you're an OSU fan, you've got to look at some of these teams that you've already played that you hope maybe get some wins. K-State obviously struggling mightily, a team that's usually pretty good. I know one of the things that was talked about a couple weeks ago is how many teams OSU's beaten, teams that have winning records, and the number at that point I think might have been 0 or 1. It wasn't many. And obviously the more teams that can have those winning records, or maybe a 6-6 season, because we've got some teams in the Big 12 that are struggling to get to that winning record, that could really help Oklahoma State too. So some teams that you might not care a bit about and how they fare in their games, that could help, because you're looking at, again, we're splitting hairs between what's seen as a good win, as a strong win, and what's not. And OSU's had so many close calls for a variety of reasons. It's really gonna help them if some of those teams that they've already beaten continue to win the rest of these next 2 or 3 weeks.
Last Saturday was a good day for Oklahoma State. Struggled to win at Ames, much too close for comfort, but elsewhere in the Big 12, West Virginia and Tech did exactly what you're talking about. They both got over 500.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about the backloaded Big 12 schedule, what that means is some of the teams in the middle get loaded with losses.
Right.
Tech and West Virginia both get over 500. If Tech can beat Texas on Thanksgiving night, Tech finishes 7-5 and looks pretty solid. If West Virginia can finish off with victories over Iowa State, over Kansas and Kansas State, they finish 8-4.
It's pretty good.
Well, you beat an 8-4 team
on the road.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good win.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's like what we're talking about with Iowa at Northwestern and Wisconsin now. So, those kinds of things would really help the OSU resume, and I think those things will happen. That's why I'm reasonably confident on Oklahoma State's. As long as they take care of business, I think Cowboys are probably going to be okay.
Their strength of schedule gets stronger without them even doing anything in terms of those teams they've already beat. Let's talk about OU. Are there some things that people maybe aren't looking at that could be helpful to Oklahoma's chances when it comes to these other teams, other games, that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, I think what I would look at is you definitely need Notre Dame to lose.
Right.
I mean, maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. Outside of that, keep playing strong. The committee has shown that its head is turned by a pretty face, and a pretty face means a rout. And so they loved all those Baylor routes early when they weren't playing anybody. So if the Sooners are just clubbing people, and if they can whack TCU, if they can win impressively in Stillwater, and just win, baby, is not the mantra, really. I mean, you are playing for style points when you're coming from behind like this, when you're a one-loss team. So I think point margin, style of play, being dominant really helps the Oklahoma cause.
Well, and I think isn't the best example of why that's important? Isn't it Ohio State from a year ago? I mean, Ohio State loses Virginia Tech. At the beginning of the year, obviously earlier in the season, probably a better loss than definitely a better loss the way Texas is finishing out the year than that loss to Texas. But they just those last few weeks just made such statement victories and did it with their backup quarterback. I don't think Oklahoma wants to try to do that, but clearly their win in that Big Ten championship game, just a clubbing, to borrow your word, a clubbing that was really hard to look away from. You couldn't ignore the way that they finished, the way they were playing at the end, and frankly, I think that's what you're talking about. I think Oklahoma could use help, obviously more than Oklahoma State could, but really, if they continue to play the way they have, I think they're going to make it almost maybe not impossible on the selection committee to pick them, but it's going to be hard to leave them out.
They're going to have a good case.
Yeah.
They are going to have a very good case.
All right. Hey, you're watching The Press Row. I'm Jenny here with Barry. Our last segment, let's talk about Bedlam, because we can. We've got great games this week. We know it. Baylor's in Stillwater, TCU's in Norman, but we're the media. We're not the teams. We can talk about this stuff. How big could this Bedlam game be, Barry? I mean, we've got essentially the epicenter of college football is here already this week. It has to rank as one of the biggest weeks in all of college football history in this state, wouldn't it? If we'd get undefeated Oklahoma State versus one-loss Oklahoma in Bedlam.
Oh, no doubt about it. And of course, we need Baylor to lose in Stillwater. We need the Cowboys to go ahead and take care of business, get to Bedlam 11-0, then play at 10-1 in Oklahoma. And it would, it would be a virtual national quarterfinal.
Yeah.
It's not for sure that they would get in, but it seems likely. So, think about that. A national quarterfinal between arch rivals played within our state. Now, when you talk about the biggest things in the state history, you talk about the '84 Bedlam game when they were ranked 2 and 3, depending on which poll it was. 1971, the lead up to the OU Nebraska game of the century, consumed most everybody, but it didn't consume the orange side of the state. And
well,
this has both sides of the river.
NBA Finals, a couple years ago, to me, that got everybody in the state involved. If you were paying any attention or cared anything about the Thunder, you were interested a couple years ago when the Heat and the Thunder locked it up in the NBA Finals. But other than that, we were talking on the Press Row podcast yesterday about the fact that nowadays everything is just bigger. It's bigger because of the TV exposure, it's bigger because of the media exposure, bigger because of the social media exposure. So everything is heightened. While there may have been bigger stakes in some previous Bedlam games, there's never been as much buildup, as much hype. It's just impossible to think that anything would approach this. And Barry, to think a year ago at this point, football was just kind of meh around here. It's crazy how it's changed.
Turned out Bedlam was a great game.
Right.
We had the overtime, the big upset, it turned out into a great, spectacle. But you're right, that was a dud game. Cowboys 5-6, Sooners were 8-3, and just sort of playing out the end of a disappointing season.
Yep.
Really thinking, even if they won, they couldn't improve their bowl. Some people thought they might get to San Antonio for the Alamo Bowl, but probably headed to Orlando either way. So, yeah, it was just Bedlam. And then to look at where we could be on, next week. The only thing I I wish this was December. I wish they were off on Thanksgiving Saturday. Think about that. Then we could have 2 weeks.
The build-up.
2 weeks of hype. But now we get 1 week of hype, the ball game, and then 1 week of debating the status of the winner and college football playoff. So we're going to be fine in the media. We're going to have something to talk about.
Well, and you know what? As I think about where we were a year ago and where we are now, I was trying to think, is it simple enough that the change has come about because of a couple quarterbacks that are now leading these teams? A year ago, it was Trevor Knight. Now Baker Mayfield has taken over, and we've seen just his ability to make plays. I mean, I don't even really know any other way to describe it. His gamer abilities. And then Mason Rudolph, it was a year ago. This week, they go to Baylor. The red shirt comes off. He plays his first game. They lose, but yet that offense showed signs of life that we then saw kick in even more in that Bedlam game, obviously, aided by an injury to Samaje Perine, a bad decision by Bob Stoops, on and on and on. But still, is it simple enough to say the quarterbacks are the difference in where we were a year ago and where we are now?
No, it's not. It's deeper than that. The truth of the matter is the biggest difference, particularly against Baylor for Oklahoma, I think it's the secondary.
That's true.
Now, I mean, they just basically couldn't guard Baylor's receivers last year.
Nope.
And they could Saturday night. That's the biggest difference in the game. Mayfield playing great, far better than we've seen out of an OU quarterback since maybe Landry Jones during a certain stretch of when he was really hot. But Mayfield's done that basically the whole year. In Oklahoma State, I think the defense is much better. Now, the combo quarterbacking with Walsh and Rudolph is fantastic, but that defense has gotten a lot better, and it's gotten really deep. They're still not running the ball worth beans, but definitely the quarterbacks have helped a bunch. But when it comes to defensive depth in Stillwater, secondary coverage in Norman, that's what's really propelled these teams ahead. Yeah,
it is just remarkable to think because I was talking to some OU players after their practice on Tuesday night, just about the hype around this game, which obviously players, coaches, they try to avoid. They try to approach things the same every week, and yet it was impossible for them to deny that it feels different. I mean, that game a week ago, the Baylor game was a huge game for them. 2 weeks ago, it was TCU for OSU. That was a huge game for them that built up differently. And now here they are again. And both teams are in this situation where people are paying attention. If they win, it just gets bigger. So it was impossible for them to deny how different it feels from a year ago. And who wants to go back to what it was a year ago? Let's continue to play big-time football games in this state. We'll remain the epicenter as long as college football will have us. Be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.